So I've decided to continue reading this chapter just because I so enjoyed this case. And I've also never forgotten this case. I'm reading chapter 7. This is part 2, and the name of this chapter is called The Corpse. We had arrived at the old age village, and I had cracked what I assumed was a joke. I was trying to be funny, but South Africans are very polite. We will laugh at each other, even if we don't find it funny. So the driver laughed heartily at my joke, and as he stopped, he told me that he would take me back to the airport at 3 p.m. and would meet me in reception when I was ready. This would leave lots of time to catch my 5 p.m. flight home. He carried my laptop case up the stairs for me as I once again followed him, this time to Matron's office. She stood up from behind her desk and greeted me. The driver told her I was here, at which we both laughed at him for stating the obvious. He told Matron he was going to take one of the residents to the hairdresser and left us alone. I sat down and someone brought in coffee on a tray. Even though it was normal Rick coffee, it was delicious, especially since it had been mixed with cremora instead of milk. So for my American friends, cremora is a coffee creamer, which I love. I swear that is the problem of my weight gain. The matron then asked if I do not mention this case to the hospital chain at all, as it was a very private matter. Of course I agreed, and in any case I did not discuss my cases with other people. I just write books. And I told her that one day I intended to write a book, at which she widened her eyes, but I reassured her that no names would be mentioned at all. So matron, if you're reading this or listening to me, I made good on my promise. She then began explaining the scenario to me. A male patient, 78 years old, had died on the previous Saturday night. In medical terms, he went into cardiac and respiratory arrest. The old age home had a frail care unit attached to it, and he had been admitted to this place a week before due to heart complications. He had been resuscitated, and after a few hours was even able to communicate with members of his family who had been called into his bedside in ICU. He was the only patient in that ward, so there were no witnesses to give an account as to what transpired that night. After a short while, the family left so that he could rest, and the matron, after making sure that the patient was comfortable, also left for home. She said that this was at about 10 p.m. She went on to tell me that the patient had actually died during the night, had passed away. I remained absolutely silent as the matron spoke. To her mind, the information in the patient's files was inaccurate. This is the information that the nurses filled in, because in it, they had stated the time of death as 4 a.m., but the doctor was adamant that the correct time of death would have been at about 12 p.m., which was midnight. When she questioned the 4 nurses who were on duty, they told her they had found the patient deceased in a restroom at the end of a passage, which would have meant that the patient had climbed over the bars of the hospital bed, walked undetected to the restroom, had opened the rather heavy door within hours of dying for the first time and being resuscitated. The matron wanted to know what happened, as the family was understandably distraught at thinking that their loved one had died in distress, hence the reason for the polygraphs. The family accepted it was their loved one's time to go, but to them this version of events that the nurses provided simply did not make any sense at all. I explained to the matron that I would decide on the questions for each subject after I had taken their statements. I had a feeling that the nurses had fallen asleep on duty, and when they woke up later, the patient had, what I want to say, transitioned. They had probably concocted the story of finding him in the restroom to cover up the fact that they were sleeping. The matron showed me around the frail care centre, and I guessed the distance from the bathroom to the frail care centre was about 20 metres. As I sat up in an unused office, my blood was once again racing in my veins. I knew I was thoroughly going to enjoy this case. Of course, I had to respect the patient who passed away, but I was realistic enough to know that this was not my grief. I was going to do all I could to give this family the truth regarding what had transpired with their loved one. After all, I had a job to do. All the nurses were currently on suspension at that time, but had been asked to present themselves at their place of employment at 10 a.m. I asked that all be kept separate after each one had been tested, to the point where they could not even phone each other. I had a plan in mind. When the first nurse arrived, I felt her defensiveness even before she spoke, just from her body language. We greeted each other and I pointed to the chair opposite me. I told her that she must know that this was about the patient who had died when she had been on duty. She said she had figured this out. When I informed her that she would be polygraphed, she voiced her doubts, saying she did not know that this would happen and it was her first time to do something like this. I explained, as I always did, that the test was simple and it was not to destroy her in any way. I also informed her that if she had something to tell me about the matter, she could tell me in utter confidence. She nodded. She provided her name to me, Zanele Sifalani. I dutifully wrote this down on the form that I use when I polygraph people. I asked her the remaining questions on the completed form, and then I told her I was going to take a statement from her. I commenced with the usual questions that I always ask in the beginning. I ascertained that she was healthy, that she had not consumed any alcohol in the last 24 hours, and since she was a black female, I did not ask her if she smoked dagga. So race, as you will see later on in the book, does play a part in crime. She was a lovely lady, extremely well groomed. I very much doubted that she smoked dagga. And even though there are some black females who smoke dagga, employed black females are not likely to do so unless they are involved with a man who will encourage them to do so. I do write a chapter about trauma bonding, which is why women become involved in priority crimes. So just thought I'd add that in. I then asked her to tell me exactly what happened that night. She started off by telling me what she had for supper while at home. My face remained impassive, but experience had made me acutely aware that when people are going to lie, they will start narrating at an unnecessary part of the story. People, when they tell the truth, are more likely to start at the point where the story starts. She finally got to the part where the patient was resuscitated and when the matron left. She said she spent her hours while she was on duty, busy in the reception area filling out paperwork, and that her colleagues were attending to various duties. She did not mention a time, and I made a mental note of that. She then told me she had heard Brenda, one of the other nurses, screaming in the ICU ward. The other 3 nurses immediately ran to her, and they all noticed that the patient's bed was empty. At this time, this is only an allegation. I never know what's true and what's not true, but this is what Zanele was telling me. I interrupted her at that point and asked her what time that was. She replied using the African way to describe time, something to 3. She meant that the time was shortly before 3 a.m. I asked her what Brenda was screaming, and she replied that Brenda was just screaming without using words. According to Zanele, the nurse I was interviewing, the nurses had frantically searched for the patient until one of them had found him in the restroom. I asked her for how long they had searched for the patient, and when Zanele said she could not be sure, I insisted that she give me an answer and asked her, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour, 3 hours, what? How long? She chose to answer 10 minutes. I asked her which nurse had found him, and she could not remember. I told her that this was unlikely, as the nurses would have been in a hypervigilant state at the time, and the mind would have recorded that type of detail. Zanele utterly ignored what I had said, and then said that the nurses had realized that he was indeed dead, and carried him back to his bed. I asked her in what position the patient had been lying when they found him, and she replied he had been lying down, face down, as if he had died while standing up and then fallen over. I asked her why the nurses had not brought a stretcher to take the deceased back to the bed, and she said that the 4 of them were so shocked they did not think of it. Unlikely. I then asked her what part of his body she held while the nurses carried him back to the bed, and she replied she held his head, while Brenda and Molly each held an arm and Nomsa carried his legs. I knew that it would not be possible for the 4 ladies to carry a dead weight in the way that Zanele had described. especially if they're carrying him for 20 meters. I formulated the relevant questions there and then to include in my test. The first question asked if she had been sleeping on duty that night. The second question pertaining to this particular issue asked if her version of events that she had provided regarding that night was a lie. And the third question asked if she was lying when she said she had found the patient in the restroom in the early hours of the morning. The answer to these relevant questions in the test must be a no. Studies have shown that the physiological changes in the human body are stronger when lying on a no answer than a yes answer. It is more difficult to lie on a no answer than a yes answer. I conducted the test, and as had become habit, I read the chart off the screen. Later, once in my home office, I would print out the chart and score it manually in pen, clearly indicating the scores before giving the results to the client. I'm going to stop there, and I might even do a third video today because it looks like I'm on a roll. Bye for now.